What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be exploring the DPS difference between the imperfect and perfect asylum staves. There's kind of discussion as to whether the imperfect staff is actually that much worse. Is the DPS difference actually very large between the imperfect versus the perfect staff? And so that kind of comes up because as of right now, only 3 guilds have cleared Asylum on hard mode. So if you think about it, not many people have access to the perfected Asylum destruction staff. So a lot of more people are going to only have the imperfect staff, so it's kind of came up as a curiosity of mine, how much DPS are we actually losing by only using an imperfect staff versus the perfect staff. So if you take a look here, the imperfect staff, every third cast of Force Shock will always apply Burning, Concussed, and Chilled, versus the perfect staff, which is every second cast of Force Pulse will apply Burning, Concussed, and Chilled. So it's kind of a question as to how much does that extra cast required, how much does that actually hurt your DPS? Because if you think about it, within 6 casts of Force Pulse, you're getting 3 procs with the perfected staff, but only 2 with the imperfect staff. So does that actually make a difference or not? So that's what we're going to be exploring today. We're going to be doing it on 2 different classes. We're going to be looking at the Sorc and the Templar. And so that kind of comes up because those are the only 2 classes that really use the Asylum staff. You could argue that Nightblades use it, but I've heard from other Nightblades that Funnel Health with the 4-piece Moondancer is still, or 4-piece IA, that's still pulling ahead compared to the Asylum with Force Pulse. I need to run my own test to kind of confirm that, but that's kind of what I've heard from some of the best Nightblades on PCNA. So that's kind of why we're only limiting ourselves to Templars and Sorcs. So now why are we exploring both of them? Wouldn't the DPS difference carry over between the 2 of them? That's a little bit more nuanced than that. That's mainly because Mag Sorcs, if you're using a Force Pulse rotation, you're also going to be using Crystal Frags. So you're going to be getting Crystal Frag procs, and if you're lucky, you're getting it every single Force Pulse. So that's going to kind of break up your Force Pulse rotation. The Force Pulses need to be within 10 seconds of each other in order for the effect to actually be applied. So the way the Sorc timing works with the Crystal Frags, and then you have to reapply dots, and then you're also heavy attacking sometimes, there could be that extra third cast, that the extra cast from the imperfect compared to the perfect, that actually resets the entire set effect. So you'll be casting 2, then you end up going over that 10 seconds, which means you have to start over again from cast 1, 2, 3. So that's kind of the rationale behind why the DPS difference might be a little bit bigger on a Sorc compared to a Templar, where you don't have something like Crystal Frags breaking up your rotation like that. So we're going to be doing 4 Parses today, one for the imperfect and perfect staff across both classes. That's 4 Parses. We're going to be taking a look at the averages and standard deviations, because I do have several Parses already for each of the 4 different categories we're looking at. The only thing we're going to be changing is going to be the perfect versus imperfect staff. Everything else is going to remain exactly the same. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started with our Parses. Starting with the imperfect Parse on a Magplar. There's also kind of a school of thought here that with using Lambris, there's a school of thought that the 4-piece Moondancer is still going to outperform the Imperfect Asylum Staff because of all the Force Pulse casts that you have to do in order to get that set effect to go off. The thinking is that the loss in burning up time from the imperfect staff, because you have to do it every 3 casts, will end up decreasing the amount of Lambris proc that you get. I've only heard this on the Mag Sorc. I haven't heard this on a Templar, because Templars do have an additional source of fire damage in Vampire's Bane and Reflective Light. that is a question that I would be interested in answering on the Magsork. With the Imperfect Asylum Staff, does that actually beat out a 4-piece Miner Slayer set, like Moon Dancer or Master Architect? So that's going to be something that I'm going to be exploring in a separate video. Alright, so there we go. That's the Imperfect Staff. I'm going to swap over to the Perfect Staff and get our ultimate up. Yeah, so for a ranged Magplar, Lambrus is still probably going to win out, even with an Imperfect Staff, partially because you don't have the Crystal Frag proc, so you're pretty much getting consistent burning uptime from the Concentrated Force set effect. In addition, you also have additional fire damage coming in from Reflective Light. So you have a source of fire damage that the Sorks doesn't have. So if you're your Sork and you're using dual lightning staves, the only source of fire damage that you're going to get is actually going to be from Force Pulse, and if that procs burning. If you're also using a fire damage enchant, then that's another source of fire damage, but Sorks don't have many sources of fire damage if you're only using 2 lightning staves. So the most that a Sork will ever be able to have is going to be 3 sources of fire damage, but a Templar can have 4 sources. It might not seem like a very big difference, 3 compared to 4, but it does actually make a... It's actually not insignificant when you're talking about Lambrus procs. Whether it's going to be worth running a different helm, monster helm set on Sorks, that remains to be seen, because there aren't many good options for range DPS in terms of monster helms. If you're not using Lambrus, then chances are you're probably going to end up using Scoria, which isn't a bad choice, but there's kind of concern that it doesn't pull as much DPS as Lambrus does. End phases of our Perfected Asylum Staff Pars. So there we go, that's the Perfected Asylum Staff Pars on a Templar. The Perfect Staff pulled 33.1, the Imperfect pulled 34. So I'm going to just add those real quick to our spreadsheet here so we can go over it later. So just cursory look, it does seem like the Perfect versus Imperfect on a Magplar doesn't really seem to hold out. It seems like they both pull about the same amount of DPS, and I do think that's because on a Magplar you're basically you don't really have any downtime. You don't have a choppy rotation with having to deal with Crystal Frag procs. If you take a look at burning, 1037 on the Perfect compared to 1029 on the Imperfect. Look at debuffs out, 79 off balance, 65 minor vulnerability, 45 burning, 67 minor vulnerability, 49 burning. So we can see the Perfect doesn't really add too much in terms of burning and minor vulnerability uptime, at least on a Magplar. So now we're going to swap over to our Magsork and take a look, see if that extra Crystal Frag proc deal, if that actually makes a difference between the Perfect and the Imperfect Staff. So we're basically going to be doing the exact same thing for the Sork. Everything's going to remain the same. We're just going to be swapping out the front bar staff, and the trait and the enchant is going to be remain exactly the same with those staffs as well. So we're going to be starting off with the Perfect Lightning Staff here. We do have a fire damage enchant, and then we're going to be using the Imperfect Lightning Staff, same thing infused with the fire damage enchant. We're just going to build our ultimate up. then we're going to go ahead and do our 2 parses. Just getting my ultimate up. There we go. Got to get our ultimate up. Getting many crystal frag procs today. So you can kind of see there that combo there. That's kind of what I was talking about with the sorts with the crystal frag procs. The time between those 2 force pulse could have been pretty substantial. Alright, so that was our perfect staff. Now we're going to swap to an imperfect staff and do the exact same thing. Just going to get our ultimate back up and do our final parse. Compare them on combat metrics and then take a look at our spreadsheets and draw our final conclusions. Sometimes I wish they made a housing item that instantly restores your ultimates, so we don't have to just wait around waiting for our ultimate to build up. I don't see how that can be broken there, or break anything really in PvP or PvE. So this is the imperfect staff parse that we're doing. So you can see that combo there of the time between force pulse shocks. I wasn't really paying attention to the timer on down there on the combat metric sting, but that could have been longer than 10 seconds, which would have reset the counter on our concentrated force set proc. So that's kind of the concern that a lot of people have with the imperfect stab. Because with the perfect stab, you just need two of them back to back to kind of get it back up. So this is the imperfect. We got 35.7. Just gonna add these numbers into our spreadsheet real quick. And for our perfect, 37.1. So that is a pretty substantial difference there, but we're going to take a look at the uptimes. That's what's going to tell us the most. So here, 69 and 66% uptime For our imperfect, 62 and 60. So it's a slightly larger difference compared to the magplar difference between concussed and burning, but I can't really say, don't know for sure if it's that's kind of what's going on here. So we're going to take a closer look at the actual comment metrics here. Burning of our imperfect did 1063. For our perfect, we did 1375. So it is doing about 33% more DPS with the burning. If we take a look at Lambris, 1106 and 769 compared to 1051 and 738. So we can't really say that the Lambris really made much of a difference between the imperfect and perfect. So burning looks like is hitting more often. We got 49 hits compared to 41 hits, so we got about 25% more hits in. Roughly 20-25% more hits in. So the minor vulnerability uptime difference 69 compared to 62. That's almost 7% difference uptime. Off balance is 82 compared to 81, so that's not really making that big of a difference there. So yeah, it seems like it would be mostly the burning that seems to be making a fairly large difference here. Looking else at our other abilities to make sure it's not something weird going on. 4668, 4929, 3901. Oops. 3486. So blockade is hitting harder on our perfect parse for some reason. It might be due to that minor vulnerability uptime. I'm not 100% sure. Mage's Wrath here to 1911, 2780. So it seems like they're pretty much equaling out. See how many frag procs we got. We've got 9 with the perfect, 10 with the imperfect, so we can pretty much call that equal to each other. Alright, so that's kind of looking at the combat metrics. So now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the spreadsheets. So you got 6 parses for each of the 4 categories here. Averages, standard deviations, and percentage differences. So we can see here the perfected asylum staff is pulling fairly consistently higher than the imperfect staff on the Magsork. We're looking at about a 3% difference between these two parses. It's about a 1k difference. Standard deviations is not that big of a difference. It's only 75 difference between the two of them, so we can say it's pretty close together, but that 3% difference does indicate that, at least on a Magsork, the perfect asylum staff is better than the imperfect by a fairly significant margin. 3% is not something it's not something that you can necessarily chalk up to chance all the time. Take a look at the Magplar though, we can see that the numbers are far closer together, and here we only have about half of a percentage point difference between the two of them, with the imperfect staff actually pulling ahead. This could just be due to the numbers here. We see we have a 35k and a 33k here and here, so that could be explaining the discrepancy there. When I was parsing and putting these numbers in, they were actually pretty much swapping back and forth between which one was going to be better. So at least for the Magplar, it doesn't seem to really affect the DPS, whether you have a perfect or imperfect asylum staff. So that's kind of a takeaway here, that at least not if you're playing a Magplar or Rangeplar, you don't need a perfect staff. But for the Magsork, the perfect staff will add an additional 1k DPS. Something to keep in mind too is that this is a solo parse, so if you are doing a solo parse within Asylum Staff, you're going to get a slightly inflated number compared to not using the Asylum Staff, and that's just because with the Asylum Staff you're getting a higher minor vulnerability and higher burning uptime than you would in a raid. In a raid, you're getting a lot more people with shock enchants. You might have another person also using the Asylum Staff, so your minor vulnerability uptime in a raid is going to be pretty similar to what you have in a solo parse. So if you were to take a 4-piece minor Slayer, compare that to an imperfect Asylum, then you might see an inflated parse on the Asylum Staff. So the difference between your solo parse with the Asylum Staff is going to be smaller compared to a raid parse when you look at the difference between a 4-piece Slayer set versus a raid parse. So that's kind of something to keep in mind there. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative. I know it was fairly long, but that's kind of the way theory crafting works. It's a lot of time and a lot of analyzing results. So I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.